Pastor Jerry asked me to take the next 2 weeks and give you an overview of our United States Constitution from the perspective of a Christian believer. That begs a very important question. Why should we study the Constitution? And the answer in my mind is crystal clear. We will spend all sorts of time to learn about the latest smartphones or the newest restaurants or the top movies. But when it comes to knowing how we should be governed, the citizens of this country, you and me, we just don't seem to care. According to some national citizenship quizzes given a couple years ago, we have been able to come up with the following statistics. 2/3 of us cannot identify the three branches of government. 3/4 of us don't know what the judicial branch does. 80% of us, that's 8 out of every 10 of us, cannot name one power held by the federal government. 70% of us don't know the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And 80% of us cannot name 2 of the rights listed in the Declaration of Independence. 44% can't define what our Bill of Rights are. And only 25% can name one of the fundamental freedoms protected by the First Amendment. And even worse, just 1 in 1,000, that's 1/10 of 1%, can name all 5 freedoms protected by that First Amendment: speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. Now, quite frankly, those statistics are appalling. I want you to listen to what President Ronald Reagan had to say about this, and I'm quoting directly from him. He said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day, we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in the United States where men were free." I went to school in the late 1960s and in the 1970s. I can tell you it's much worse now. Most high school students are not even required to take a government or civics class today. That's why 2 college professors could write a book a generation ago called The Godless Constitution. That book has been adopted into the curriculum of colleges and universities throughout the country. And that book, which was supposed to have been a solid educational treatise, was nearly 200 pages long, but it did not contain one single footnote. That is, they did not cite one independent source to validate their claims that our Constitution is godless. Now, in order to fully understand what the Constitution means, what it says, and how God influenced the drafters, we first need to know the context of how this document was created. 6 years after the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781, this country decided to hold a constitutional convention. And this convention lasted 4 months, from May 25th, 1787 to September 17th, 1787. The country had been operating for the past 6 years under what was called the Articles of Confederation. And it was clear to everyone that those articles were really inadequate to operate this country, to govern the United States of America. There was no power in the federal government to compel the individual states to do anything, and as you might expect, each of the states began to quarrel and compete with each other. Something that was legal in South Carolina was illegal in New York, and nobody knew what was what. Well, something had to be done, and that something was the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The original purpose of the convention was to patch up the holes in the Articles of Confederation. But the 55 delegates there in Philadelphia soon realized that the Articles of Confederation, even if they were to be amended, would not be workable to govern this country of ours. And so the convention was redirected to the framing of a whole new constitution. Two plans were almost immediately proposed. One of them was called the New Jersey Plan, very simple in its structure. Each state would have one vote. Basically, this was simply a reorganization of the Articles of Confederation. They added a federal judiciary, but that was it. Now, obviously, the smaller populated states supported this New Jersey plan because they would have the same power as the more largely populated states, such as Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and New York. There was a second plan that was placed on the table, and it was called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan said there would be two legislative houses. The lower house, where members would be elected according to the population of each state, and then an upper house whose members would be elected by the lower house. And the Virginia Plan also provided for a national executive and a national judiciary. Obviously, the larger states supported the Virginia Plan because the legislature was based on state populations. And so if you were living in New York or Virginia or Pennsylvania or one of the other larger states, you would be much better able to dictate what was going to happen nationally. None of the supporters of either of those two plans was willing to compromise or negotiate in a settlement of any kind. And so as a result, the convention became very contentious, and it appeared that the convention itself was going to dissolve about a month into their deliberations. Half of the New York delegation had already left in disgust. Rhode Island, the smallest state, was so concerned that they would get ganged up on that they didn't even send a delegation there in the first place. And just then, when things were at their lowest, God had mercy on the affairs of America. His vehicle was probably the most unlikely source that you could imagine. An 81-year-old unbeliever, alleged deist named Benjamin Franklin. Now, you need to know that other than George Washington, who presided over the convention, Franklin was probably the most influential delegate there. He was a world-renowned figure. He was known and admired in all the European countries. He could walk into any court in any country there and immediately have an audience with the king or with the people in charge. And it was Franklin, as the American ambassador to France, who had persuaded the French government to support the colonies with arms and men and material and money, especially money, during the Revolutionary War. You need to know that without the backing of the French army and the French Navy, Washington never would have been able to trap the British Army at Yorktown and win the war. And so, on June 28, 1787, Franklin rose to speak at the convention. And I want to spend a few moments sharing with you what he said. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who are engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests, our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter from this unfortunate instance despair of establishing governments by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service. If you listen closely, you heard 8 different biblical references by Franklin in just 9 sentences. The response of the convention to his speech was absolutely astounding. Like I said, Franklin was probably the most non-religious delegate present. Now, you need to know that technically Franklin's motion to have someone come in and lead a prayer session every day failed. The reason it failed is because the convention had no money to hire a chaplain. So Washington, as president of the convention, did the next best thing. He called a recess. And for the next 3 days, the delegates engaged in prayer and reflection and some serious soul searching. Many of them went to church that weekend and heard a 4th of July oration. And when the delegates reconvened again 4 days later, it was with a set of rearranged priorities. And our Constitution was drafted, and a nation was preserved. A nation that has done more to influence this world in the last 230 years than any nation in the history of mankind. The reason that Franklin's speech had such a dramatic impact was that 52 of the 55 delegates present were active Christians. By requesting prayer, Franklin was simply following the example of the Continental Congresses that were in session during the Revolutionary War. Did you know that the first official act of our first Continental Congress on September 16th, 1774 was one of prayer? And daily prayer was held in Congress throughout the Revolutionary War. On at least 15 occasions during the war, Congress declared days of thanksgiving, or days of fasting, or days of prayer. That was the context for Franklin's speech. And that was why it had such a profound effect on all of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. All of them had lived through the war, and they remembered. Well, subsequently, Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed a compromise that was taken and adopted by the convention. There would be a 2-chambered legislative branch. The members of the House would be chosen based on state population, which favored the larger states. But each state would have 2 senators, chosen by each state legislature. This favored the smaller states. There would be an executive who could veto legislation, but the legislature could override that veto by 2/3 majority. And there was a judiciary designed specifically to be the weakest of the 3 branches. This became the model that was adopted. Charles Evans Hughes, who was Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court for 11 years, from 1930 to 1941, once said, and I quote, "We are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is." And reflecting that attitude over the decades, American courts have struck down such long-standing practices that were still widely supported by the people. Practices such as removing school prayer from the public schools. And each one of us can add to that list. It goes on and on and on. What's wrong with that picture? Did our founders ever intend for a time when a 5-person majority of Supreme Court justices could impose their will on an entire country as to who has what freedoms? That's what's happening today. Is there a foundational base to constitutional law that is unchanging and never subject to any of the cultural biases which are dominating our nation in 2022? To answer those questions, we have to understand the whole notion of a charter or a declaration and how it interacts, how it interrelates with the Constitution. Most simply, a charter or declaration is a mission statement. It's a contract. It grants you certain rights and privileges and comes about on the basis of an established authority. In the Bible, this was known as a covenant. Correspondingly, a constitution is a set of bylaws or rules that accompany the charter. The Constitution spells out how we are going to do things and what happens if someone doesn't do those things. You don't have law simply for the sake of law. And you don't have a covenant or charter that is void of law. You need both. You need the charter on one hand, and you need the rules on the other. And one does not work without the other. So when we look at the Declaration of Independence and the truths that it held as self-evident, the list of men's inalienable rights to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness, or in today's terms, the right to private property, those ideas were not the invention of great minds of that time and that era. No, they were revealed truths that our founders found in the pages of Scripture from God Himself. In writing the Declaration of Independence, our charter, Thomas Jefferson listed 3 great principles. First, he staked the claim for lawful separation from England on 2 concepts. First is the laws of nature, that is, the will of God that is revealed to us through nature. And then secondly, on the laws of nature's God, that is God's will revealed in the Bible itself. Then he went on to say, secondly, that all men were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property. And then thirdly, he said that government exists from man to protect man's inalienable rights. Our Constitution was designed to protect those inalienable rights because government comes from we the people. This is what entitled America to become a free and independent nation. The Declaration of Independence is America's birth certificate, and its legality is based upon its foundation, which is bedrocked in Christian principle. The Constitution is the rules that we have established to protect those inalienable rights. This relationship between our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution has been acknowledged throughout our history. 2 examples. In 1839, John Quincy Adams, who was our 6th president and the son of John and Abigail Adams, was asked to give a speech in New York on the 50th anniversary of the inauguration of George Washington as our first president. It was the Jubilee speech of 1839. And in talking about the Constitutional Convention, John Quincy Adams said this, and I'm quoting from his speech: The Constitution of the United States was the work of this convention, but in its construction, the convention immediately perceived that they must retrace their steps and fall back from a league of friendship between sovereign states and go to the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence. In that instrument, the right to institute and to alter governments among men was ascribed exclusively to the people. The ends of government were declared to be to secure the natural rights of man, and that when the government degenerates from the promotion to the destruction of those rights, then the people have the duty to dissolve that government and to institute another. The revolution itself was a work of 13 years and had never been completed until that day. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are parts of one consistent whole, founded upon one and the same theory of government. That's John Quincy Adams. 25 years after his speech, his Jubilee speech, Abraham Lincoln was asked the same question about this relationship between the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. And he responded by drawing on the imagery of Proverbs chapter 25, verse 11. And that verse says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver." And Lincoln went on to explain that the apple of gold was like the principles contained in the Declaration of Independence, and that the Constitution was like the silver frame which went around the outside of the picture of those golden apples. Lincoln said the picture frame was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. The picture frame, the Constitution, was made for the apple, the Declaration. Let's begin our look at the United States Constitution. And like any good scholar, we should start at the beginning, which is the Preamble. Here's what the Preamble to our Constitution says. "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Didn't say we the government, it says we the people. We do those things. And it sets forth right in that preamble the 5 purposes of government. And do you know that each of them is biblically based? Establish justice. You'll find that in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 14. Ensure domestic tranquility. You'll find that in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Provide for the common defense. Look at Luke chapter 22, verse 36. Promote the general welfare. You'll find that in Romans chapter 13, verse 4. Secure the blessings of liberty. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17. And Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. Our framers, for the last purpose, wrote, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. They did not say to secure the blessings of freedom. They deliberately used the word liberty. Now, today, we tend to use those words interchangeably. We all know they're kind of synonyms, freedom, liberty. But to the founders, there was a huge difference between those two words. The founders thought that this idea of liberty was a sacred one. Think about it. Think of your history. Sons of Liberty. The Liberty Bell. The Liberty Tree. The Statue of Liberty. To them, liberty was a sacred trust. It was a precious possession. It was a privilege. It was a right that they would be responsible to give an answer for. Liberty meant everything to them. It was something worth fighting for, and yes, even dying for. It was far more valuable than mere freedom. Let me give you the definition of freedom. It's defined this way. Independence, the license to do as one wants. the permission to do as you please. It means that you have the right to do something, but it has one potential drawback. It can also be narrowly defined as only having the permission to do it. Permission is necessarily granted by someone, which means freedom can be revoked by that someone. And remember, Thomas Jefferson described liberty in the Declaration of Independence as one of the certain inalienable rights. Liberty was second only to life. It was a right that was endowed by our Creator. Each one of us has the inalienable right of liberty. It cannot be revoked. Liberty provides for the protection of an individual's rights, expressly because with liberty, we have been endowed by our Creator with the capacity for self-government. Freedom is something that a government grants. Liberty is something that we own that a government can never, ever take away. Why? Because liberty comes from God Himself to each one of us. Under freedom, others can take away an individual's rights anytime they can acquire enough political power to do so. It's called majority rule. Majority rule, people, is not always a good thing. But that's not the case with liberty, because that is a right endowed from our Creator. Contrary to what most people assume today, America is not a democracy. It is a constitutional republic. In a democracy, the people are the ultimate authority, and they can exercise their lawmaking power by majority rule. A republic is a representative form of government where authority rests upon the individuals, officials who have been elected by the people. But listen, what makes the American Republic unique to all the world is that the sovereign authority is not the elected representatives. It's the Constitution to which they are subject. It operates by the consent of the governed, hand in hand with the rule of law. America is a government of laws, not of men, and much of that body of law is based on the Bible. That's why Patrick Henry could tell the Virginia delegation, "Give me liberty or give me death." And that's why we, the people, established the Constitution, so that the blessings of liberty would be secured for us and our posterity. I want you to know, first and foremost, we are not operating under a godless constitution. And secondly, you cannot study the Constitution without knowing what our Declaration of Independence says and what its principles are. The two go hand in hand and cannot be separated. Initially, under the Constitution, each state was to receive one federal representative to Congress for every 30,000 inhabitants in that state. Today, that number is roughly 760,000 people. But that's how we come up, and it's apportioned today among the 435 representatives. But back then, since slaves accounted for much of the southern population, southern states wanted to count their slaves as though they were free inhabitants, which meant that they were using the slaves to try to send more pro-slavery representatives to Congress. The anti-slavery founders from the North strongly objected to this. They wanted only free residents to be counted. And they told the Southern delegates, hey, if you want more representatives to Congress, then free their slaves. Well, they didn't want to do that. And so the final compromise was that only 60% of the total slave population, that is, 3/5, would be counted to calculate the number of representatives to Congress. So what it did was reduce the number of representatives from southern states with large slave populations. The 3/5 clause had nothing to do with the worth of any individual. The clause was there simply to calculate representation. And this is a prime illustration of why we need to really know the Constitution.